Three arguments I'm going to forward. Firstly, principally why we owe a duty to ourselves over our community. Secondly, why community-based societies take a very large risk for certain groups of people. And finally, why individual freedoms are more accessible and more actionable. First, but before all of that, some setup on what we think these states look like. The first thing to say is that on our side of the house, when you have states with a strong focus on individual rights, we think these rights tend to be enshrined in constitutions or laws. Things like freedom of expression, things like freedom of movement, freedom to own property, and we think a lot of we think that these rights, like I said, these rights are upheld in law, so are unlikely to change into the long term. Comparatively, in a world that's focused more on community, they often trade off a lot of these individual rights in favour of the community, I guess. But what that's to say is that you might have far higher amounts of things like taxes, and in contrast to things like allowing individuals to spend that money how they want. You might have far higher trade-offs in the amount you're allowed to say, or the amount you're allowed to publish, or whatever you're able to do for what is perceived to be the good of the community. That's the setup we think that exists. First point then on why we owe a duty to ourselves over our community. I think the first thing to say is that only each individual person actually understands what is best for that individual person. The community, as much as they can know you intricately from an outside point of view, obviously can never know what is actually best for you more than you can know what is best from yourselves. And you're the only person that's best able to action whether or not your needs are looked after. The second thing to say, though, is that oftentimes helping ourselves is logically prior to being able to help our community, which is to say that you must first be able to be in a good financial position, or alternatively you must be able to be in some sort of good mental state or something else like that to actually be able to help and assist other people. And I think the third thing to say here, though, is that a lot of the mechanisms that they're likely to tell you about why people care a lot about the community and help them in very good ways are not things that go out of human nature on our side of the house. And when you protect the rights of individual people, and when you allow those individual people to flourish and to better themselves first, a lot of those people are very, very likely to, in the future, go on to help people that are in their community anyway on our side of the house. What we say, though, is that we protect that very fundamental first-line right to themselves as well. The third and final thing to say is that a duty to community tends to disproportionately disadvantage the most oppressed or most vulnerable people already, because those are the people who need to help themselves but who are often forced to help others, and we think that's principally bad. The second point then about why community-based societies take on a very large risk. And I think the basic thesis behind this point is just to explain that for you to benefit from a community-based society, it relies on that community being good for you, looking out for your interests well, and doing all of those sorts of things. Why are there inherent issues with this? I think the first claim we'd like to forward is that communities are seldom like flat societies or like completely flat, completely equal. And hierarchy is often necessary in being able to make community work. Some people need to make decisions. You need to be able to resolve disagreements in some ways. And the people who tend to go to the top of that hierarchy are decided in a couple of different ways. Either that are people who are historically the most powerful, historically have had the most money, historically have had, all of those sorts of, who are historically the most powerful, and that power continues today. Secondly, they might just be most powerful right in the current state and those sorts of things. Or thirdly, they might be a part of a majority group. They might be people who have the most connections and things like that. But most importantly, those people, even though they're in the same community, likely have very different lived experiences and very different interests from other sorts of people, even when they're in the same community. And even when those people have the best intentions, they are bad at looking out for those people who do not share the same experiences and do not share the same types of interests as they do. And obviously that's for the reason that when you make community-based decisions, you have to do some sort of trade-off. It's not each individual person making a decision for themselves, and so even when they have good intentions, they do bad things. But the second thing to say is a lot of people might not have good intentions, and those people might be the ones who are promoted to the top. And we see that a lot already around the world. In like faith-based communities, for example, often there's a lot of oppression that goes towards women. Often there's a lot of oppression in certain parts of town that might go to more disadvantaged communities and things like that. So we say that when community decisions are made, they often They often harm certain people. We think that is really bad. Those people on our side of the house would be able to make their own decisions and be able to help themselves far more, as I'll go on to explain. But the second thing to say, though, is that community-based decision-making and community focus always forces some people to go without for the good of others, and we just don't think that is necessarily principally good. When you think about how the first part of that argument explains that the people who are most likely to go without are those who are already struggling the most. Third point then about why individual freedoms are far more accessible and far more actionable. The first thing to say is that this is a way to best approximate and best gauge everyone's preferences because they're making their own decision. Only you know what you like and only you know what's actually important for you. But the second thing to say is on our side of the house, it's far easier to action and change those circumstances because you're not necessarily coming up against the force of people within your own society who are most proximate to you, who are the ones that are holding you back. That can leave you feeling very alienated, that can leave you feeling very, not feeling like you're actually able to change your position. Obviously, you still have to overcome barriers potentially on our side of the house, or you have to have some sort of resources on our side of the house as well. But the difference is that your community, the people who are most proximate to you, the people who you're constantly surrounded by, are not the ones that you have to be able to come up against in a huge, large group. Instead, it's more individual to individual, which we think is far more equitable and far more likely to come out with good outcomes.
Thank you very much for that speech. Let's now welcome up Lucy O for the case of the negative.
Freedom is about trade-offs. The freedom that I have to hold a gun impacts the freedom of other people to live their life safely. We say that in a world where the freedom of the individual is held above all else, the people who are most vulnerable are always fucked over because their freedoms are impinged on in order to allow the wealthiest people of the society to have the freedom to not pay the taxes that go to hospitals, the freedom to have actions that deeply hurt those individuals. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to quickly respond to the principle. Then I'm going to explain why the most important people in this debate are the most vulnerable people who are protected by a communitarian principle. And then finally, on why it's better for those people and society as a whole. Firstly, on the principle. 2 things to say here. First thing to say is, insofar as the material is that freedom is important because it allows you to seek the thing that you like, that is best for you, I think if we explain that the well-being of everyone is advantaged by this, then that helps you because you don't need that freedom in the first instance, you just get the thing anyway, and that's why Harper says it's important. But secondly, I don't think they explain how freedom actually allows them to have the capacity and the autonomy to do what they want. We say that often, if you have a freedom to own a house in New Zealand, it doesn't mean you own that house in the first instance. Lots of the time, we don't have the capacity to have that freedom in the first instance. The second thing to say, actually I'm going to go into that later. So on why we care most about those people. Obviously, you could be this person, and that's the person you should care about the most vulnerable people in the society who want the least amount of control over their actions. Because no, even if those people are given the freedom, Harper gives no pathway by which they attain any type of well-being under their side. Because even if I have the freedom to earn lots of money, I don't get that money in the first instance. We explain to you that the people who don't have the agency to shape things for themselves are the most because they have the most capacity to suffer. Secondly, because they lack the ability to do things like move to a different state. So they're trapped in the state system that currently exists. But thirdly, because they have the least political capital and they can't fix those particular problems. Given that, why do we think it's better for everyone? The important thing that most vulnerable people. We get no material as to why that is likely to be the case. I think that in a communitarian perspective, when you have the decisions being made on behalf of the community as a whole, what happens is the median people look at the people wealthier than them and say, hey, I want to take their money. Firstly, because that has the best benefit to them because they're able to get the most of it. But secondly, because they're angriest at those people. And that's what happens under a community system. What comparatively happens in this? I think that the way that individual freedom is prioritised, firstly, as Harper says, is often within constitutions and things like that. And the important thing about constitutions is that they are really old and really difficult to change. And often they are written by the people who had the most power in those states. And that means the freedoms that are chosen, for example, the freedom to bear arms, the freedom to be a slaveholder or whatever, are necessarily enshrined within that constitution and are not updated in the same way. Comparatively, when things are based on the community's good, that allows it to be adapted much more with time. The second thing to know is that freedoms often conflict and cooperate with each other. Because obviously, we all think that we have a freedom to avoid being harmed. We also have a freedom to do lots of things which might harm people. So necessarily, the government is constantly having to make trade-offs in a world of freedom. I think that they always make choices in a way which are likely to be particularly harmful because they are shaped by the powers that be. Things like donor lobbying, which tell them which freedoms to particularly prioritise. And the impact of that is it takes away the freedom of those people the most. What does that look like? I think it looks like things like in the United States where you have a lack of redistributive welfare systems that actually give people the money they need the most because the freedom that's been prioritised is the freedom for people to take the most money home at the end of the day. Or the freedom not to get health insurance even though that fucks over everyone else. And that is the worst outcome in this debate. No, that's the kind of thing that those freedoms are extremely harmful. The counterfactual is really good. A couple of different ways that's the case. Firstly, when we're talking about the good of the community, often it is not mutually exclusive because the freedom that I have to go to a hospital is the same as other people's freedoms. The communitarian perspective is one which is much more likely to be not mutually exclusive because the well-being of other people is likely to build on your own well-being. For example, if I care about the good of the community, I care about the most deprived people in my community having more money because that means that the a burgeoning middle class is likely to be really good for my ability to sell goods as the rich people. That means you're much more likely to have that perspective and you don't have to make those same trade-offs in a way which is really beneficial. But secondly, the way that the framework of a community good is helpful is it means that when you do something for one group, you think you necessarily need to do it for another group and you need to help them. In the comparative world when it's freedom, you think because I've given freedom to everyone, that necessarily requires them to all do really well. In a communitarian perspective, you think that you need to actually create good and it's focused on that outcome rather than the process of giving them freedoms in the first way. What are the impacts of this? I think we get policies and structures that provide freedom in principle, but in practice are used to exploit the most vulnerable people, because the way that freedom is used is always to benefit the most advantaged people. Comparatively on our world, when everyone cares about the community good, firstly, you get the kind of taxation systems that lead to things like hospitals existing that people can go to, that lead to the capacity for people to buy houses and have all of those processes, and that's really good. And we're happy to trade off any kind of freedom in order to achieve that. Look at places like Scandinavia, which have extremely high taxation policies, but it allows them to seek the community good. That is the kind of world that we would prefer much more, given that I've already explained to you should care the most about the most vulnerable people. But secondarily, I think that it means that you're more likely to get the capacity for people for the state to become less hierarchical over time. Harper says, well, the state is likely to have a curve, but I think the individual approach is what creates that curve and that hierarchy in the first place. Because when you give everyone freedoms and say they're all okay, you never give people the capacity to pull themselves up. Comparatively, when everyone wants the community to success, including pulling the worst off people up, that is when you allow people to change their own agency and have control. So insofar as you care about freedom, you care about giving them the capacity to make that freedom and the capacity to make their own choices, rather than the autonomy of being able to choose anything they want to do. Given all of that then, neoliberalism has fundamentally failed. An approach which focuses on the community will help the most vulnerable people. That's what we care about the most.
Awesome, thanks very much. We now welcome Tracy to give us a second.
I think the problem with Lucy's speech is she frequently explains how you can convince people to give to the community because they are selfish. You can convince people to give money to others and to economically support society because it gives them more people to buy from your business. That is a mechanism she gives you in your speech, which proves why people are self-interested, and the best way to get them to do things is to cater to that self-interest. 3 points in my speech. Firstly, on duty. Secondly, about community-based states. And then thirdly, about individual-based states. Firstly, on duty. Harper gives you 3 layers of principal duty to protect yourself. The first one is that you are the only person who can guarantee this. The second is that this is logically prior to helping others. And the third is that the counterfactual is one of oppressing minorities on top of existing layers of oppression. We hear 3 responses. The first one Lucy says is that obviously they can try and meet this burden of helping others and therefore making sure everyone in the society is helped. The problem with this is they have to guarantee that every single person in their society is helped, because otherwise they have asked vulnerable people to trade off their own freedoms to help a community that does not give back to them. They have to look after every single person, or they have failed some people. The second thing, though, is Lucy goes on and on about positive freedom. She talks about how people like the money to make the most of their freedoms. The problem with this is they also attack positive freedom because they ask people to give up their money to help other people do things, right? So that obviously reduces people's own positive freedom and ability to do things on their side of the house. So that is not a relevant principal argument in this debate. The final thing we hear is just this throwaway line about the idea that people don't choose their own community, which I think is an additional reason you should probably not ask people to make sacrifices for a community they didn't choose. You don't choose to be born into a community where you're a minority, where you're a gay minority, where you're a woman, and a community that doesn't care about you or want to give back to you. You should obviously care about yourself more. Secondly, moving to community-based states. And I think we are quite clear here that it is highly likely that the state is set up in a way that benefits the people that have the most power, and that is likely to oppress people who are from minority backgrounds. It is likely to oppress women and gender minorities. And I think the only responses we hear are that there is no mechanisation to back this up. So I'll just add a little bit of mechanisation here. The first one is that we are talking about states, right? This is about states based on individual rights versus community-based rights. So you're talking about having to have a single government that is able to lead a country. You're talking about states that have always been based on conquest and colonisation. So obviously there have always been a small group of leaders or rulers or monarchy or whoever in that country that have set up their power structures to benefit them in a way that has continued through time. There are literally no examples of communitarian states that still exist today based on those things. And if you're talking about the Pacific Islands, those are some of the most community-based oppressive cultures to live within. But additionally, we explain that at the state level, because this debate takes place in states where you care about community, there are likely to be significant disparity between the needs of the people within that community, and especially even within homogenous states, there are still likely to be trade-offs between what people want. And so that means there are probably trade-offs that benefit the majority of people within that state in a way that disadvantages all the minorities. But even if this is about just communities, and this isn't about the state level, in community-based societies, you would still have different communities fighting against each other for resources, so I don't think you get the perfect allocation they want to talk about. The final thing to note is just the true harms of this, because I think they talk about the benefits of letting people get money to buy houses, which is obviously a bit hard to believe given you're asking people to trade off their own money to buy those things. You're asking people to make their own sacrifices in their private lives that harms them. But what you're actually asking people is to give up their jobs, to give up their careers, to give up their aspirations of being a working woman, to give up who they actually want to marry in order to give back to the community in a way that the community has decided benefits them. That is oppressive. That leads to actual harms to people. It is unclear the material benefit that produces in community. I think that is unlikely. Moving now then to how we protect individual rights and why we think individual rights is so much better on our side. Because I just want to emphasize there are several reasons why, even in a community about individual rights, you are likely to get more than just the bare minimum of base rights. You are likely to get quite expensive insurance policies. And that is because people who act in their self-interest are likely to want to protect themselves in the worst case scenarios. So that means they don't just look at rights that are in the Constitution. They look at setting up insurance systems that help them in case the worst possible case scenario applies to them and they lose their jobs. They look at setting up healthcare systems that will look out for them, because in a perverse, in a kind of contradictory way, that actually seems like something a self-interested person would be interested in. If you don't expect other people to give you money out of the goodwill or the freedom of their heart, you're probably likely making sure there is a compulsory system that exists to make sure you're protected. And I think that means we can claim a lot of the benefits that Lucy talks about. But I think even if we don't manage to claim those largest possible benefits, we're still able to protect the base liberties which they can never guarantee on their side, and I think you should weigh those incredibly highly in the debate, because the kinds of basic liberties that are protected in constitutions and laws are things like the ability to protest when you are being oppressed. It is things like the ability to not be imprisoned unjustly, and all of those things are incredibly important basic liberties, things that are unlikely to be changed, because they say that maybe you don't update laws frequently, but we think even in our worst case, that is still something that benefits people as opposed to the world in which they ask people to live, one in which people are repressed continually. The only possible response we hear to sort of mitigate our benefits is the idea that constitutional rights are not updated with time, across time. I think the problem with this is just obviously not true, because by their own mechanisms, they tell you why people who act in their self-interest are probably curious about, are probably likely to find it appealing when people talk about civil liberties and rights. That's why civil rights movements are incredibly, popular. They talked about individual liberties and applying those liberties to other people, because it would be, arbitrary or discriminatory to not apply those same individual liberties equally across the country. And I think that is what this debate gets to at its core. It is very difficult in an individually rights-based society to ask people to genuinely believe in individual rights but take them away from others, because that means there is a risk that those rights get taken away from them as well. At the lowest possible instance, we always protect those rights. They ask people to give them up and sacrifice them for a future that I think is very unclear and is more likely than not quite oppressive and bad. Very proud to affirm.
Thanks very much for that speech, and that'll wrap up the standard portion of the debate in what's last here.
I don't want to be an American idiot. 3 reasons why. Firstly, how you should frame this debate. Secondly, on the kind of social benefits we're able to accrue, particularly to people who are most vulnerable, who are where the biggest difference in this debate takes place. And finally, on the fundamental problem with freedom. Okay, firstly, on how to frame this debate. I don't really understand the response that we'll be principally inconsistent if we can't help every single person. Because obviously neither side of this house can help every single person in a society, and it was never our goal to do so. I think when you read this motion and you're deciding which of these different states you would prefer to live in, basically you should make a risk calculus. And that calculus is, there is a real decent chance I will be born poor or working class in this country. And that there are 3 reasons that we think that makes our case more important. The first is that their kind of society is one that doesn't enable social mobility, that doesn't redistribute wealth, so there is a much higher risk that you'll be born poor in their society and live a much worse life. Secondly, that the way the state treats people actively exacerbates the suffering that poor people have by not giving them medical care and things like that, whereas on our side it tries to alleviate that. So if you are born poor, your life will be much worse on their side of the house. And thirdly, just like if you happen to be born poor, you simply cannot move between these different... So why should you care about that risk particularly more than anything else? Although I think we get better benefits for everyone in society, but particularly poor people. Firstly, it's because they can't move to another country. This wasn't some kind of stringent principle. It's just a basic check that if you are born really rich in a communitarian country and decide you don't like it, you can always change your mind later, but you'll never be able to immigrate if you're born poor, so that's the thing you should worry about a lot more. Secondly, because there just are a huge number of them. It's a big portion of society, but it's also the portion of society that is the most affected by changes that governments do, by the policies of the state, because wealthy people in any kind of society have things like lawyers and accountants and clout and political capital and wealth that allow them to insulate themselves from other things that affect them. That's what all of that content is really important about. Lucy's already explained it, and that is what you should value the most. Now let's talk about that. The first is let's talk about the social impacts and stuff like that. Look, I think the debate's just going to break if they're like, oh, but in an individualist society, there are lots of incentives to enforce like compulsory insurance payments that seem to me like you're impinging on people's freedoms and institute basically all of our policies anyway, right? But I think the obvious difference is, should the state, even if people generally agree that it would be a good idea to do this, should the state coerce people to do it because they think it is in the common good, or should they say, no, we can't do that even if we think it's in the common good, because it would impinge on people's freedom? And I think it just is better to do the latter, because I think firstly the fact they're trying to bring it up shows you that it is really, really valuable to have things like health insurance for everyone in society, like a working public health system that you're able to access. Not just because if you get sick, it is able to alleviate the sickness you have and stop you from physically suffering and not being able to go to work and having all of these things that really harm you, irrespective of what legal freedoms you have. But also because if you're someone who's not sick, other people being able to access healthcare freely and quickly stops you from getting sick because they don't come to a debating tournament and give you COVID, right? So it's in everyone's interest to do this. But it never happens on their side for three reasons. Firstly, people are optimistic and just think bad things won't happen to them. Secondly, they think it impinges people's freedom, so in the kind of society they stand for, like America, you don't have compulsory health insurance because it would be seen as an impingement on freedom even if it was in the community good. But thirdly, there are just massive collective action problems, because me individually deciding to donate a portion of my wealth to the healthcare system doesn't solve that problem. You need to force everybody to do it, even if it does impinge on a group of people's freedom. Okay. Finally then, they tell us, oh, but the things the state does will be coercive and oppressive to minorities. But this misses all of the material Lucy gives you, which is that either side of the house, the state is likely to do things in ways that are harmful to minorities. It is likely to say free speech is so important that we can't stop you from being vitriolic about trans people. It is likely to say freedom from religion under laïcité means you can't wear a burqa to the beach. Even when you frame it from a freedom perspective, people have different definitions of what freedom is. Some people think that unborn people have a freedom to be alive, and some people think you should have a freedom to access reproductive health care. And one of those groups will win out and coerce the other to protect someone's freedom. And obviously the powerful group will win out every time. But on their side, even if you did just give everyone perfectly equal freedom, it doesn't solve the problems, because they tell us it's historical minorities who've always been oppressed. So there's no reason they'll be able to lift themselves up by the bootstraps, right? I think we need active government intervention through things like forced affirmative action programs, through things like just active investment in fucking social housing and benefits and all of those kind of things to alleviate the lack of capability those people have, which they never get because it gives you freedom, but also other people's freedom, like freedom to discriminate, actively hurts those groups and sets them back in society. They suffer really badly on their side. Now, let's talk about the problem with freedom. Because they tell us it's very difficult to have inconsistent freedoms for different people. But the point is, people think it's a fair freedom. They say, oh, everyone has freedom to marry someone of the opposite gender, and that's really fair because everyone has that. But obviously it's not, but through their framework it is. So it's really easy for people to rationalize that to themselves. But secondly, even if all of that is true and everyone in the society thinks you have perfect freedom, that means necessarily half of people are less well off than the median income, the median person. And they blame those people because they think it is their fault for not being in that position. They don't want to help them because they think they should have been able to help themselves. They don't need more freedoms because the top half were able to do it without that. There's no impetus for social change. There's no impetus to help the poor. And if you're born below that median point, you're fucked.
Thanks very much, Peter. So we'll reverse the speaking order half the speaking time and welcome back up Lucy to give the leader a reply.
we don't know where exactly the spectrum of society sits. And we don't know whether it's going to be like a massive libertarianism like we talk about, or just generally the idea of some freedoms existing. And I think that the other team has relied a lot on the idea of this being this extremely oppressive and terrible state. But I think that obviously there is the spectrum. And we say that regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, how communitarian or how individualistic a society is, the risk calculus is that a communitarian society will always be predisposed to having better outcomes for people for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because a focus on community good rather than freedoms means that you're more likely to directly identify what problems need solving in society and solve them. So that rather than focusing on freedoms which are nonsensical, which do not matter, you focus on the community good that is most valuable. Secondly, we say that it gives you the most capacity to create change for the most vulnerable people in society. Because when you have a communitarian culture, and generally the culture is aiming towards creating good, it means you're better able to solve those kind of collective action problems they talk about. So insofar as it is good for everyone's society to benefit, which both teams have acknowledged, it is far better facilitated in a communitarian society when those people actually have the capacity to come together, the systems to come together, the mindset to come together and make those changes. And we explain to you that that is the best possible thing as opposed to freedom, because direct good is the thing that you should care about most rather than freedom. On the most vulnerable people and how they don't have the ability to help themselves. We tell you that these are the people who you should care about most in the debate. Firstly, just because you could be born as one of those people and you should really care about them, but also we give you a variety of different material down the line. The other team obviously cares about them too. They say that, well, if you are a minority in terms of being a gay person or a woman or things like that, you need these freedoms in order to protect you. The first thing to know is I do not think they explain why the way that that happens is likely those kind of freedoms. Because, as they explain, often states can be coercive, often they don't like minorities very much. And in that instance, I think when you focus on individual freedoms, as we explained to you, often those individual freedoms, because they are directly mutually exclusive as opposed to communitarian good, because you have to pick one or another, the one that is picked is always the one that fucks over the minorities. And there's no explanation of why there would be that kind of help. So I don't think that they ever explain how they particularly benefit them. Given that, there is active harm to those people. So even if you think we don't prove any benefit, they make their lives much worse by creating freedoms which actively harm them. Secondly though, because they don't have the capacity to change the way that society exists, things like the ability to have food and shelter are the things you should care about the most in the debate, rather than things like the freedom to protest. Two reasons for that. Firstly, because the prerequisite to access those other more diffuse freedoms like freedom to protest, you need to have food in order to do that. But secondly, I think that's the trade-off that most people would make. I think most of us live in a society in which we choose to trade off our freedoms for our own well-being. We understand that there is some degree of trade-off, and I think we're happy to make that trade-off. Grace says there are still incentives to help them if you are self-interested, but we explain how uniquely a communitarian society is what best allows you to access the things that you are incentivized to do. That you cannot do that in a society which is individualistic, because the control will always be in the most wealthy individuals who utilize the freedom system and are best able to weaponize it to help the people who are most vulnerable.
Thanks, Lucy. And the final speech of Officers Cup 2024, we welcome back our time.
I think the negative team seems to misread this debate down the line a little bit as just, is conservatism better or is socialism better? Because this is actually a debate about far more. It's actually a debate about how we enshrine rights. On our side of the house, when we give welfare, should we give it to the individual and let them decide what they should do with that welfare? Or should we give that welfare to church leaders and let them decide how to redistribute it as in what's best aligned with their community? Should we give that welfare to people to make that decision? Or should we give it to the community? Enshrining community rights does not mean you necessarily get good redistribution or that you don't. In fact, our case explains why redistribution is uniquely done poorly on their side of the house, because it allows structurally more powerful groups to make decisions. Because not everyone everywhere is living in a democracy, and they never explain why those leaders ever make good decisions for you. But thirdly, even when you are in democracies, democracies are necessarily majoritarian. The weighing that Peter gives you himself about why these minorities matter the most are always going to miss out in these majoritarian societies. The negative has two paths to victory. The first is where a lot of their focus is on the idea that there's a lack of capacity to action your rights. But their mechanism to give you capacity to action their rights is through people caring about others and wanting to help communities and identifying the best place for that to go. Our contention was twofold. Firstly, a lot of this caring about others is symmetric on both sides of the house, and when you enshrine individual rights, doesn't mean that innate feeling goes away. But even if you don't believe that, Grace explains why people are really scared on our side of the house that they might end up in the position Peter says the majority of the people actually already live in and is very, very likely for you to live in. And that's the reason that they don't then, that's the reason they worry that they might be in a rainy day position. They care about those rights, they care about the position they potentially may end up in. But secondly, their own weighing explains why this is a very likely place for people and why people therefore consider that in their calculus. Lucy tells you they have two benefits in reply. Firstly, they're more likely to identify important issues, and secondly, they then have the capacity to change those collective action problems to solve those issues. But all of that is obviously downstream from the community making good decisions from you, something we gave you right back at First Affirmative that received no response down the line about why you get those good decisions made by the community. In fact, we flipped all of that point when we explained to you that how the community hierarchies work, why they always necessarily leave out certain groups, and why it's compounded by the fact that the majority of societies around the world are not homogenous. Yes, their Scandinavian examples are good because those are the most homogenous societies in the world, but in the societies that are the majority of the world, where there is no homogeneity, people lose out, and those people are far, far worse on their side of the house. Our path to victory was simple. Firstly, the person who you can trust yourself, the person who you can trust the most is you, and with the resources that you have, you're best able to make decisions for yourself on our side. But secondly, for the most vulnerable people who they care about the most, affording individual freedoms to all is the only way to protect that baseline autonomy, where we can ensure people aren't horrifically persecuted on our side of the house because they have a right to hold up and go to the court with. That's something that could happen on their side of the house where that right is not enshrined in the Constitution and does not exist. I think that they put a lot of trust into people that they never proved to you are good at making decisions for the most vulnerable.